Between ambition and ruin stood Italy's contested soil. When Tarentum's citizens sank Roman ships in 282 BCE, they unleashed forces beyond their control, summoning Pyrrhus of Epirus, Alexander's cousin and heir to shattered dreams. His elephants and phalanxes shattered Roman legions at Heraclea and Asculum, yet each victory left him weaker than before. Across Sicily, he chased glory, while Rome rebuilt with patient determination. At Beneventum, the Republic's iron discipline finally broke the king's brilliance. Pyrrhus departed, leaving behind a name forever linked to triumph that costs too much, victories that destroy the victor. Across the Italian peninsula, in the early 3rd century BC, the world was shifting beneath ancient feet. The air carried the clang of iron and the murmur of treaties. Cities that had once stood content in their isolation now watched one another with suspicion. Rome, no longer the fragile republic of its ancestors, had learned how to devour allies by embracing them first. Each new alliance tied another region to its cause, until the Latin League became a net that caught the central peninsula entire. South of Latium, the rich lands of Campania shimmered in summer light. Volcanic soil fed olive and vine, and Roman settlers were planting more than crops. They were sowing permanence. Where the Samnite tribes had once hurled back the legions from their mountain strongholds, new Roman roads now glittered with sun-baked dust. Venusia, founded as a colony in 291 BC, stood like a mailed fist between the Apennine ridges and the coastal plains. Its walls rose from confiscated Samnite land, but its purpose was larger, a watchtower over the Greek world beyond. Farther south, the Greek cities of Magna Graecia gleamed like jewels scattered along the sea. Tarentum, Heraclea, Metapontum, Thurii, Croton, each a fragment of an older glory carried west by exiles from Sparta and Sybaris. They spoke of philosophy and freedom, yet their rivalry was perpetual. The festivals of Dionysus drowned debate in laughter and wine, while mercenaries kept uneasy peace outside the walls. Still, beneath the marble colonnades of Tarentum, the elders remembered a time when they had sent fleets across the Adriatic and commanded respect from kings. Now Roman banners fluttered scarcely 100 miles away. Beyond the hills, the Samnite peoples nursed their bruised pride. Defeated but not broken by 3 long wars, they watched the Roman colonies advance like creeping fortresses. The Lucanians and Bruttians, once fierce and independent, had been drawn into the Roman orbit by alternating threats and gifts. It was said that no tribe south of the Tiber could now make war without a Roman consul's permission. Yet even in peace, resentment brewed. By contrast, the Greeks saw themselves as guardians of an older civilization. They measured their lives by the gymnasium, the theatre, and the agora, while the Romans, grim, disciplined, suspicious of pleasure, seemed half barbarian to their eyes. Rome's strength was order, Tarentum's pride. The two virtues were fated to collide. When Paestum was refounded as a Roman colony in 273 BC, its amphorae of wine and grain began to undercut Tarentine merchants in the western markets. Trade that once passed through Greek harbours now followed Roman roads northward. To the Tarentines, it felt as though invisible hands were tightening around their necks. Their response was to turn inward, closing ranks, arguing fiercely in the assembly over whether to arm or appease. The city was divided between democrats who shouted for autonomy and aristocrats who whispered of compromise. Each faction feared the other more than the enemy beyond the gulf. In those years, Roman envoys became familiar figures in southern courts. They carried polite smiles and demanded obedience with the ease of men who knew refusal would not last long. To most Italic peoples, submission meant survival, but among the Greeks of Magna Graecia, submission was unthinkable. Their ancestors had defied Persian kings. How could they bow to rustic Latins? One late summer evening in 282 BC, the question turned from rhetoric to reality. The city of Thurii, harassed by Lucanian raiders, appealed to Rome for protection. The Senate, always eager to display its guardianship, dispatched a small garrison and a fleet to anchor near the Gulf of Tarentum. It was a legal act under Roman interpretation, but to Tarentum it was an invasion of their sphere, a violation of their waters. For centuries, an old treaty had limited Roman ships to the northern seas. None were to sail past the Licinian Cape. Now Roman prows glinted in the sun where none had dared appear before. At the theatre, as citizens gathered for a festival, rumors spread faster than the actors' lines. The Democrats cried treachery, the aristocrats urged restraint, and the crowd roared approval for whichever speaker promised vengeance. Pride, that ancient companion of Greek liberty, won the day. When the wine-drenched celebration spilled into the harbour quarter, torches flared, oaths were sworn, and the citizens of Tarentum rushed the docks. They had spotted the Roman ships offshore, 5 triremes, their crimson pennants snapping in the sea breeze, and decided to expel them by force. From the quays came shouts and the crack of timber. Missiles flew. The Roman crews, taken by surprise, tried to row into deeper water, but the Tarentine vessels were swift and their sailors eager for glory. 2 ships were sunk before sunset, the others driven off in flames. On shore, the crowd exulted. The sea belonged to Greece again, they said. Yet as night fell, the older men among them stared toward the horizon where the fires still burned, knowing Rome would not forget. When news reached the capital, the Senate met in grim silence. To the Romans, the destruction of their ships was not a drunken brawl. It was an act of war. Still, they moved with calculated restraint. Ambassadors were dispatched to demand reparations, not yet vengeance. The delegation's leader, Lucius Postumius, was an urbane patrician, more diplomat than soldier. He expected bluster and a fine. Instead, he found insult. The Tarentine assembly received him with mockery, and when he began to speak, the crowd jeered so loudly that his words drowned in the noise. Someone hurled a handful of dung at his toga. Another pulled the hem of his garment, laughing that Rome could keep its laws north of the Cape. Postumius left the hall spattered but silent. "You have chosen war," he said at the gate, "and war you shall have." That sentence, carried home by wind and rumour, changed Italy's future. For all their revelry, the Tarentines sobered quickly when they grasped what they had unleashed. Rome's retribution would come not as a raid, but as an occupation. Their only hope lay across the sea, in a man whose name already stirred both fear and admiration. Among the council of elders, someone whispered it first: Pyrrhus of Epirus, a cousin of Alexander, a king without peace, a commander whose victories gleamed from Macedon to the Aous River. He had the one thing Tarentum lacked: a disciplined army and the ambition to match Rome's. Messengers were sent at once across the Ionian Sea, bearing gifts and pleas. Let him come, they said, as savior and commander of all Greeks in the west. Meanwhile, in the Roman camp at Venusia, soldiers polished their armor for the campaign to come. The consul Publius Valerius Laevinus inspected new recruits drawn from every Latin town. Standards gleamed, trumpets brayed. Southward marched the machine of a republic that had learned to make conquest a civic duty. Behind its order stood a truth that Pyrrhus himself would soon discover, that Rome could lose 100 battles and still rise stronger after each one. Still, in that autumn before the first clash, Italy seemed suspended between two worlds. On one side stood a republic of farmers turned legionaries, hardened by discipline and the memory of near defeat. On the other, a league of Greek cities clinging to the language of freedom, but splintered by luxury and distrust. Between them stretched the silent hills of the Samnites and Lucanians, waiting to see which power would claim their loyalty next. In Tarentum's agora, the marble statues of heroes watched as heralds read the Roman ultimatum aloud. Some citizens shouted that the gods would defend them. Others muttered that the gods had long since departed. When the decree ended, the crowd dispersed in uneasy quiet. Across the water, the Ionian waves glittered, carrying toward them, unseen, yet inevitable, the sails of destiny. The winter of 282 BC settled uneasily over the Gulf of Tarentum. The harbours lay restless beneath grey water, and beyond the mists, the Romans were said to be gathering ships. The city, that proud Spartan colony turned merchant republic, could not keep still. Its citizens quarrelled in the agora, drank too much at the festivals, and muttered in the baths about treachery from the north. For 2 centuries, Tarentum had lived beneath the shadow of a treaty. It was old enough that even the magistrates argued about its wording, but its meaning had once been clear. Rome would keep her ships north of the Licinian Cape. The sea beyond was Greek, inviolate. That clause had been written when the Republic was a provincial curiosity, when her legions still trembled before Samnite hillmen. Now, Rome's shadow reached from the Tiber to the Ionian coast, and her admirals spoke of patrols, not boundaries. To the Tarentines, this was theft by another name. The clause had been the last assurance of sovereignty, a line drawn in salt water. So when Roman triremes appeared off Thurii coast under pretext of protection, many in Tarentum felt their lungs fill with fury. The incident at Thurii, Rome's garrison planted in a Hellenic city, was the spark in dry grass. At first, only whispers moved through the streets. But as the annual Dionysia approached, the rumour spread like fire through oil. 5 Roman ships were sailing south again, perhaps to anchor in Tarentine waters. The festival had begun before the sun reached its height, wine flowing as though the city wished to drown its fear. By midday, the amphitheatre throbbed with laughter and song, when a scout burst in from the harbour, crying that Roman sails were visible beyond the cape. The celebration curdled into outrage. The people streamed downhill toward the sea, their songs turning into shouts. Philocharis, the tribune of the demos, tried to mount the steps and calm them, his voice hoarse from oratory, but it was too late. The ships were already entering the bay, 5 black prows bearing crimson standards, oars flashing like teeth in the sunlight. To the watching Tarentines, this was blasphemy against the old pact. They jeered, then hurled insults, then stones. Wine and fury blurred into the same fever. A few captains, still drunk from the festival, leapt aboard small boats and ordered them rowed straight at the foreigners. No one knew who loosed the first missile. Some said it was a boy with a sling, others a fisherman who cast a spear through drunken laughter. But the effect was the same. The Roman admiral, unprepared for battle, shouted for withdrawal. The wind caught his sails at a bad angle. His leading trireme collided with the harbour chain. Tarentine mariners swarmed over it, armed with daggers and boarding hooks. One Roman officer was dragged onto the quay and beaten before he could speak a word. 2 more ships, trapped by the current, were rammed and sunk. The rest fled out to sea, their decks smeared with blood and tar. At dusk, the fires on the horizon lit the bay red, The crowd roared as though victory had already been declared. In the great colonnade of the agora, however, the city's elders gathered in alarm. They had not ordered this. Some among them had spent the day trying to restrain the mob. When they summoned Phylacaris, his robe still damp with sea spray, he claimed it was the will of the people, that freedom had been defended. Across the benches, the aristocrats seethed. One, an old man named Agis, struck the marble with his staff. "You have bought us glory for a day," he said, "and ruin for a generation." His words found no purchase. The assembly cheered Phylacaris instead, shouting that Rome's arrogance had been punished at last. For a few days, Tarentum feasted on its victory, but even in celebration there was unease. Merchants whispered that Roman retaliation would come swiftly, and the city's hired mercenaries demanded higher pay. By the time the Roman envoys arrived, the mood had shifted from triumph to brittle defiance. Lucius Postumius, sent by the Senate to demand explanation, entered the city with only a few attendants. He found the streets hung with garlands, though the laughter that greeted him was edged with mockery. In the assembly hall, the Tarentine crowd rose as one, ostensibly to honor their guests, though many came only to jeer. Postumius stood beneath the painted ceiling, hands clasped behind his back, waiting for silence. "The Senate," he began, "requires reparation for the outrage against her ships and men." The words had scarcely left his mouth when someone from the benches called, "Perhaps the sea should demand reparation for Rome's arrogance." Laughter burst out, cruel and echoing. The Roman waited, his face impassive. Another voice shouted that they could pay his price in fish. Then, from somewhere in the gallery, a cup of wine arced through the air and splashed his toga. Others followed, grapes, crumbs, jeers. A young man in festival garb mimed rowing a trireme and crashed into the floor in mock death. Postumius did not flinch. He adjusted his garment, red with spilled wine and filth, and looked up at the raucous crowd. "You laugh now," he said, "but soon you will bathe in your own blood." The words fell like cold iron. For a moment, the hall went still. Then the laughter resumed, louder, desperate. When the envoys departed, the people cheered their humiliation. But among the city's leaders, panic began to fester. Reports came that Rome had already recalled her consuls and ordered new levies. Allied towns were sending troops north, not south. The assembly, once so loud, now met behind closed doors. Phylacaris still shouted of liberty, but fewer listened. The aristocrats sent secret letters to Tarentum's old allies in Sicily and Epirus, pleading for aid. In private, they agreed that only one man could match Rome's machine, a king bred for war, one whose name could still terrify Macedon itself, Pyrrhus of Epirus. He had the blood of Achilles in his veins, or so his bards claimed. He had duelled champions at Aetolia and conquered Macedonian kings in their own mountains. He was young enough to believe in destiny, old enough to command the loyalty of hardened men. To the Greeks of Italy, he was a relic of Alexander's vanished glory, a living emblem of what they had lost. The Tarentines sent envoys across the Ionian Sea that winter. Their ships carried gifts of gold and fine armor, but the truest offering was opportunity. If Pyrrhus crossed to Italy, he could become more than the savior of one city. He could be the founder of a Western Hellenic empire, a new Alexander among barbarian fields. Meanwhile, in Rome, the Senate met in its cold chamber on the Capitoline. The elders listened as Postumius recounted his humiliation. Each word weighted with deliberate outrage. The youngest senators clamored for war. The older ones murmured of precedent and patience. Then the door opened, and silence fell. Appius Claudius Caecus, the blind patriarch who had built the great Appian Way, was carried in by his sons. He had not spoken in the Senate for years, but now he demanded to be heard. His voice, cracked but commanding, filled the hall. "Have we come to fear the laughter of Greeks?" he asked. "When we were poor, we fought Samnites and Gauls. When we were few, we conquered Latium. Shall we now be mocked by those who feast in silk?" No one answered. The old man turned his blind eyes toward the chamber's murmur. "If Tarentum seeks war, give it to them, not as vengeance, but as lesson." The vote was swift. The legions were summoned from Campania, and the consuls given authority to march south when the winter roads cleared. In Tarentum, the sea turned rough, and traders began to vanish from the harbour. The taverns fell quiet. Men looked to the horizon, waiting for sails they could not yet see. Only Philoccharis, undaunted, declared that the gods would defend their freedom. Yet even he flinched when the first dispatch from Pyrrhus arrived, its seal marked by the royal eagle of Epirus. Within it lay a promise and a warning, both. "I will come, but I command." Winter hung heavy over the Ionian coast when the Tarentine envoys reached Epirus. Their ships limped through heaving grey water, masts groaning, sails whipped to tatters. In their chests lay gifts of gold and polished bronze, but the true offering was more dangerous, a chance to summon war. At Ambracia, beneath the fortress of the Molossian kings, Pyrrhus received them with guarded interest. He was no ordinary monarch. Born of Aeacide's line and kin to Alexander's house, he had spent his youth in exile and his manhood in battle. Exile had taught him patience. Warfare had given him purpose. The envoys spoke of Tarentum's peril, of Rome's advance beyond the Licinian Cape, of a treaty trampled beneath iron boots. While they pleaded for help, Pyrrhus listened without moving. Within him, ambition stirred like a sea creature disturbed from sleep. The ruler of Epirus had long dreamed of a wider stage. His campaigns in Macedon and Thessaly had honed his army into an instrument of precision. Yet Greece offered only rival kings and brittle alliances. The invitation from Italy sounded like destiny disguised as diplomacy. To answer it would be to carve out a Western empire, a realm that might one day match Alexander's vanished conquests. Still, calculation tempered his eagerness. Italy was vast, Rome relentless, and alliances there as shifting as coastal sand. In his private councils, opinion divided. The cautious advised neutrality. The daring urged immediate departure. Among them, the diplomat Cineas argued that victory upon victory would never bring rest, that conquest merely postponed peace. Pyrrhus heard the warning and dismissed it. Greatness, he believed, could not wait for calm seas. Preparation began before the snows had melted from the mountains. Messengers galloped through Epirus and Thessaly, calling veterans to arms. The clang of hammer on anvil rang through the valleys as armourers forged pikes and spearheads. Herds of horses were driven down from the high pastures, and herdsmen who had never seen war learned to serve among cavalry squadrons. From the south came a gift of astonishing scale, 20 war elephants sent by Ptolemy II of Egypt. Their arrival caused wonder throughout Ambracia. The beasts towered above the city gates, swaying like living fortresses, their tusks sheathed in bronze. To Pyrrhus they were more than curiosities. They were the emblem of a new kind of warfare, one that could unnerve even Rome's disciplined ranks. By early spring, the plains outside the capital had become a sea of shining spears. 20,000 phalangites stood in serried order. 3,000 horsemen wheeled across the fields. Thousands more archers and slingers practiced until their fingers bled. The king inspected them daily, correcting posture, adjusting armor, speaking to each man as if he alone mattered. He was that rare leader who could command by presence rather than decree. At night, torches flickered along the shore, where shipwrights labored without pause. The scent of pine resin and burning pitch filled the wind. Merchants grew rich, selling rope and salted meat, while priests sacrificed bulls to the sea gods for safe passage. In the royal hall, maps of Italy lay spread beneath lamplight: Lucania, Samnium, Campania, each name a promise waiting to be claimed. When the fleet finally set sail, the harbour overflowed with spectators. Women threw garlands upon the waves. Boys climbed rooftops to watch the departing ships. The king's flagship led the armada into open water, its bronze figurehead gleaming through the spray. For 3 days, the crossing was calm, but on the 4th, storm clouds rolled in from the south. Lightning split the sky, rain lashed the decks, and oars splintered against the waves. Some transports vanished into the dark, others scattered far from the fleet. At dawn, the survivors found themselves off the coast of Italy. Mist hid the mountains, but the smell of land carried through the wind. The battered vessels limped into Tarentum's harbour, their sails shredded, their crews hollow-eyed from exhaustion. On the quays, the citizens waited in uneasy awe. They had asked for aid and received an army. They had invited a champion and summoned a conqueror. Pyrrhus stepped ashore, clad in bronze, that caught the pale sunlight like flame. Behind him came his guard of Epirus, their armor burnished from the march, and the elephants trumpeting as if to announce the gods themselves. The streets fell silent. Even the proud magistrates bowed low when he entered the city. In the council chamber, speeches were made and alliances proclaimed, but the new arrival wasted no time on ceremony. Tarentum, he declared, must become a fortress, not a playground. The theatres were closed, the festivals suspended, and civic idleness replaced by drill and duty. Markets that once sold wine and perfumes now overflowed with spears, shields, and grain. The laughter of the port gave way to the rhythm of marching feet. The transformation was swift and harsh. To the citizens, the visitor from across the sea seemed half king, half commander. He paid little heed to their customs, cared less for their arguments between democrat and aristocrat. What mattered to him was readiness. Those who complained found soldiers at their gates. Those who cooperated found security. Within weeks, Tarentum resembled a camp more than a city. Beyond its walls, the countryside trembled under the approach of Rome. Scouts reported consular legions moving south, their columns long and orderly. Fires were seen at night upon distant hills. Beacons or warnings, none could tell. The Epirot ruler studied the reports without alarm. To him, these were the first moves of a contest he had awaited his entire life. One evening, he stood upon the ramparts overlooking the Ionian Sea. Below, the surf whispered against the rocks, and the ships at anchor rocked gently in their moorings. Behind him, his officers waited for orders. Before him stretched the unknown. In that moment, he seemed to sense the immensity of what he had begun. Across this water lay the power that had subdued every foe it faced. Yet within him burned the conviction that courage, properly led, could still defy inevitability. Before midnight, runners carried his commands through the camp. The phalanx would assemble at dawn, the cavalry to its flanks, the elephants in reserve. South Italy was to become the anvil upon which two civilizations would test their mettle. In Tarentum, fear and pride mingled in equal measure. The citizens watched their strange ally move among his men, his silhouette bright against the forges. They had summoned him in desperation. Now he ruled them by necessity. Above the city, banners bearing the Epirote eagle snapped in the sea wind, and the people began to understand that history had turned. The next morning, as the first light spilled across the harbour, Pyrrhus rode out through the eastern gate. Ahead lay the plains of Lucania, where Roman legions were already on the march. Behind him stretched a city no longer its own master. Between them rose the faint promise of thunder, the sound of two powers gathering for the trial that would decide the fate of Italy. Spring arrived across Magna Graecia with deceptive gentleness. Olive trees shimmered silver beneath the breeze, and the Gulf of Tarentum lay calm as glass. Yet behind the city's white walls, the air tasted of iron and fear. The age of pleasure was over. A new order had come ashore with the king from Epirus. The transformation began quietly. First, the heralds announced the closure of the theatres. Then the flute players and actors found themselves dismissed from the temples and hired instead to sound the cadence of marching men. Festivals that once spilled through the streets were cancelled, and the artisans who crafted garlands now wove ropes for siege engines. The gymnasia, proud emblems of Tarentine grace, were turned into barracks. Where philosophers once argued, soldiers cleaned their armor. Those who had summoned Pyrrhus soon realized the price of salvation. The city's democratic leaders protested that Tarentum's liberty was being undone, but their voices carried little weight against an army that did not speak their tongue. A council of Epirate officers replaced civic debate. Decisions came in commands, not votes. The gates were sealed, curfews imposed. In the evenings, the harbour, once a spectacle of light and laughter, fell silent, save for the creak of masts and the ring of hammers upon wood. Warships were being fitted with new rams, their prows shaped like snarling lions. Fishermen complained that the docks were too crowded with soldiers. Merchants grumbled that their ships were seized for defence. Yet none dared resist openly. The man who now ruled among them carried the memory of Alexander in his bearing, and the authority of conquest in his stride. To his own soldiers, Pyrrhus was the embodiment of restless purpose. He inspected the phalanx formations at dawn, his cloak whipping behind him in the sea wind. He dined standing, ate little, and demanded much. He seemed incapable of stillness. Even his allies found him exhausting, an energy that burned too fiercely to last, yet impossible to ignore. His officers knew the signs of gathering obsession: maps strewn across his table, wax tablets covered in sketches of terrain, long silences followed by sudden bursts of command. Beyond the city walls, he drilled his men until the plains shook with the rhythm of their march. The phalangites advanced in blocks of gleaming pikes, each line a mirror of the next. The elephants, newly accustomed to the foreign air, practiced crossing wooden bridges and charging straw-filled dummies that represented Roman formations. Pyrrhus watched with satisfaction, but also with a hint of unease. He had fought Macedonians and Persians, but never the strange discipline of the Republic. The legions, he had heard, fought like machines, adaptable, unbroken by terrain or fatigue. From the north came reports of their movement. Consul Publius Valerius Laevinus had crossed into Lucania, his legions advancing like a tide. They fortified each hill they passed and left behind garrisons as routes of occupation. Their precision impressed even the king's scouts. Rome had no need of splendor. Its strength lay in persistence. Inside Tarentum, resentment simmered. The merchants whispered that Pyrrhus intended to make the city a province of his own realm. The citizens, used to the freedoms of a democratic polis, chafed under the weight of foreign soldiers. Even the aristocrats, who had once hoped to use the Epirate army for their own advantage, began to feel sidelined. Yet fear held them all in silence. They had invited a lion into their house, and now dared not ask it to leave. Still, the city's transformation could not be denied. The harbour teemed with ships. The walls bristled with new towers. Granaries overflowed with supplies. Smithies burned through the night, turning out spearheads and arrow shafts. Pyrrhus had achieved in weeks what Tarentum had failed to do in years: unity through necessity. One afternoon, he summoned the city elders to the council chamber. They came reluctantly, expecting reproach. Instead, he spoke of Rome's advance, of the need for order and endurance. His tone was measured, but his meaning unmistakable. Tarentum was no longer a republic. It was a garrison in a greater war. When he finished, none dared object. The elders bowed, and the guards opened the doors to dismiss them. Outside, the air smelled of smoke and salt, the scent of a city learning obedience. As the weeks passed, allies began to arrive from the interior. Samnite envoys entered through the southern gate, their cloaks torn from years of war. Lucanian horsemen followed, proud and wary. They remembered their defeats at Roman hands and hoped the newcomer might restore their honor. Pyrrhus greeted them with calculated warmth. He understood their resentment and meant to harness it. To each, he promised the same reward: the restoration of lost lands and the humiliation of Rome. Among the Epirate officers, opinions divided. Some trusted these Italic allies. Others saw them as unreliable. Pyrrhus ignored the doubts. He knew that unity, even if born of desperation, was worth the risk. The coming war would not be won by numbers alone, but by momentum, the illusion of destiny. In the hills beyond the city, he chose a plain for review. The combined army gathered there under a pale sky, banners lifting in the sea wind. Veterans from Epirus and Thessaly stood beside Lucanians and Bruttians, their languages blending in a rough chorus of command. At the center of the formation, the elephants shifted uneasily, massive and otherworldly. When the signal trumpet sounded, the host moved as one, a river of metal and dust flowing toward the horizon. From a rise above the field, Pyrrhus watched them with a satisfaction that bordered on reverence. It was not merely an army, it was the embodiment of his will, the answer to the restless ambition that had driven him across the sea. Around him, his lieutenants murmured admiration, but he remained still, eyes fixed northward, where the Roman legions waited unseen. At dusk, the soldiers returned to camp. Fires flickered across the plain, and the sound of distant drums mingled with the murmur of the sea. Within his tent, the king studied a small bronze map of southern Italy. His finger traced the line of the Ceres River, where the Roman consul was rumored to encamp. The terrain there favored defense. Open plains bounded by water, good ground for phalanx and elephant alike. He decided the first blow would fall there. In Tarentum that night, the citizens listened to the distant thunder of drills and wondered what dawn would bring. Some prayed for victory, others merely for survival. They understood now that their fate was no longer in their own hands. The city of poets and traders had become the anvil upon which empires would strike. Far to the north, the Roman standards moved through Lucania, like constellations of flame, steady and unhurried. Between those flames and the sea, Pyrrhus prepared to test his fortune. The time for speeches had passed. Only iron could speak now. Morning rose pale and cold over the Ceres River, the sky streaked with low clouds that promised heat by noon. mist hung over the reed beds, masking the glint of bronze and steel. On one bank waited the legions of Rome, on the other the host of Epirus and her allies, arrayed beneath the eagle standards of their restless king. Between them flowed the river, a barrier of shallow water and shifting gravel that neither side wished to cross first. For weeks, Pyrrhus had studied this landscape. The plains near Heraclea offered rare open ground, perfect for his phalanx and for the new engines of terror that had come with him from Egypt. He had camped near the left bank, his men building bridges of boats and rafts while cavalry patrolled the fords. Across the water, the consul Publius Valerius Laevinus had encamped with nearly twice his number, 4 Roman legions and their allies, a wall of shields as disciplined as it was determined. The Epirot scouts brought back tales of uncanny order. Even the campfires of the Romans burned in measured lines, each interval exact. Pyrrhus, long accustomed to the chaos of Hellenistic armies, found himself impressed and uneasy. He rode out at dawn with a small escort, his armor bright against the haze, and studied the enemy camp through the drifting mist. The lines of fortification, the steady rhythm of watch changes, the sound of horns calling the cohorts to formation. It all spoke of a people trained not merely for war, but for endurance. They fight like stone, he thought, though no one heard the words. Laevinus, knowing the danger of delay, chose to strike first. His engineers repaired the bridges during the night, and before sunrise, the Roman vanguard began to cross. The legionaries moved through the water in tight order, shields raised, their scarlet plumes dimmed by river spray. The clatter of armor startled the birds from the reeds and carried across the valley to the Epirota camp. Pyrrhus reacted instantly. Trumpets blared, his men rushed to arms. He dispatched his light infantry, Cretan archers, Rhodian slingers, and Greek javelineers to hold the crossing until the phalanx could form. They met the Roman skirmishers in a storm of missiles, arrows, and stones striking sparks off shields. For a time the line held, but the enemy cavalry found a ford upstream and charged down upon the flank. The Epirot lights broke under the impact, retreating toward the camp in confusion. The king saw the collapse and spurred his horse forward, rallying 3,000 of his best Thessalian riders. They thundered into the Roman advance, lances leveled, hooves drumming through the shallows. The shock of the charge checked the consul's vanguard and gave the phalanx time to deploy. Now the great pikes rose in ordered ranks, the steel points glimmering like frost beneath the sun. The first clash came in the center, where the Roman hastati met the Macedonian wall of spears. The legionaries hurled their pillar, hoping to break the pike heads, then closed with short swords, but the wall would not yield. Each push drove them backward, step by step toward the river. Yet the phalanx could not move quickly. Its strength was depth, not agility. The Romans fought like a tide against a cliff, washing up, receding, and returning. At the height of the struggle, Pyrrhus was thrown from his horse. A Roman trooper lunged for him, blade raised, but an Epirot officer struck the man down. Dust and cries filled the air. The king vanished from sight. When he reappeared, another warrior rode beside him, wearing his distinctive armor and plume. Megacles, his companion from youth. The disguise was meant to confuse the enemy, yet it nearly doomed the army. As the fighting raged, a Roman centurion brought down the armored rider with a thrust to the throat. The body fell, glittering beneath the sun, and a shout spread through the Roman ranks that the king was dead. Legionaries took up the cry, waving the helmet as proof. Across the field, the Epirot line faltered. Men turned, uncertain, and the pike wall began to waver. The Romans pressed harder, sensing victory. From the rear, Pyrrhus saw his army bending under the weight of despair. He tore off his helmet so that all could see his face and rode along the front shouting his name. His voice cut through the chaos. The sight of him restored order. The line steadied, shields locked once more, and the push resumed. The battle hung poised upon a knife's edge. Then came the trumpeting of elephants. From behind the Epirot lines, 20 of the massive beasts advanced in ponderous rhythm, each guided by a mahout seated on its neck. The ground trembled beneath their steps. The Romans had heard rumors of such creatures, but had never faced them. The horses screamed and reared, the legions closed ranks too late. The elephants struck the flanks first, crushing cavalry and scattering auxiliaries. Their tusks, capped in bronze, swept men aside like reeds. Arrows and javelins bounced off their hides. The Roman formations buckled, cohorts collapsed inward under the weight of panic. Those who stood were trampled. Those who fled clogged the river in their retreat. Pyrrhus seized the moment. He led his cavalry around the Roman left and drove them into the shallows, where armor and shields became burdens. The water ran red. The consul's standard fell, rose again, then vanished in the crush. By late afternoon, the valley belonged to the Greeks, yet victory brought no elation. The field was a ruin of bodies, its triumph muffled by exhaustion. 7,000 Romans lay dead, 2,000 more captured. But Pyrrhus had lost nearly 4,000 of his own, many among his best veterans, and the loyal Megacles among them. The cost weighed on him like armor left on too long. When night came, the king walked through the camp, alone. Fires flickered against the silhouettes of elephants tethered among the tents, their trunks swinging restlessly. Around them lay the wounded, groaning softly. The smell of blood mingled with smoke and salt from the nearby sea. His officers hailed him as victor, but he could not answer. He had won the battle and lost a portion of himself. Across the river, the Romans were already gathering their survivors, forming ranks even in defeat. No cries of despair reached the Epirot lines, only the measured sound of men rebuilding their camp. Pyrrhus watched the torches move through the darkness and understood that these enemies were unlike any he had faced. Other armies broke. The Romans endured. At dawn, he ordered the burial of the dead. He stood by Megacles' bier, his hands resting on the fallen man's sword, and allowed himself a single breath of grief before turning to his generals. The war, he knew, had only begun. The legions would return stronger, as iron does from the forge. Southward, the Tarentine merchants began celebrating the news of victory, but their cheers echoed hollow across the gulf. Heraclea was not a triumph. It was a warning. The king of Epirus had proved his courage, yet in the measure of losses, he sensed a darker arithmetic. If every victory cost the same, even success would lead to ruin. By midsummer, his army was repairing its arms, and the elephants were being reshod. Messengers rode north with peace terms, though none believed they would be accepted. The consuls of Rome would already be raising new legions. Pyrrhus looked toward the hills where their standards had last stood, and wondered whether the gods favored those who refused to yield, or those who dared too much. The plain of Heraclea lay quiet now, but the dust still bore the marks of struggle. Hoofprints, trampled reeds, and the imprint of sandals pressed into hardened mud. From those traces, an age was taking shape. The moment when Greek brilliance met Roman endurance, and the cost of glory began to show its price. The field at Heraclea had scarcely cooled before the crows descended. Men gathered the wounded, while the elephants, restless and bruised, swayed beneath their keepers' cries. Smoke hung in the still air, and the Cyrus River ran thick with silt and blood. Pyrrhus stood at the edge of the plain and watched the haze drift over the hills where the Roman torches had burned through the night. They were gone now, withdrawing north in measured silence. No cries, no disorder, only the slow rhythm of discipline retreating to fight another day. Victory had come, yet it brought no peace. The Epirot camp was full of mourning, men searching for lost companions, surgeons bent over makeshift tables, the smell of wine mixed with blood. Megacles was dead, his armor cleaned and laid beside his bier. Even the elephants seemed subdued, their massive shapes looming in the mist like monuments to a costly triumph. When word reached Tarentum, the city erupted in celebration. Theatres reopened, feasts filled the streets, and poets declared that Greek courage had humbled the Latin upstarts. But in the royal pavilion, Pyrrhus did not smile. The enemy's losses had been dreadful, yet the Romans were already raising new legions. He had seen their resilience and understood what it meant. A war of exhaustion, not a war of brilliance. Still, he hoped that victory might open the path to peace before the peninsula devoured both sides. He chose his most trusted envoy, Cineas of Thessaly, to carry terms to Rome. Cineas was known for words that soothed kings and bent councils. He had persuaded whole cities to surrender without battle. His instructions were clear. Offer friendship in exchange for recognition of Greek independence, promise to free Roman prisoners without ransom, and speak of a future alliance between equals. Pyrrhus hoped that diplomacy might achieve what arms could not. The envoy crossed the Apennines beneath winter skies. His retinue of Greek soldiers and captured Romans marched through villages half burned by war. Everywhere they went, people stared, but did not cheer. The news of Heraclea had reached even the poorest farms. Rome had lost, but not been defeated. When Cineas entered the city, the Senate assembled in the Curia, silent as marble. Rome was still nursing its wounds. Black cloths hung from the doors of patrician houses. Yet the senators came, their togas heavy with solemnity. The Thessalian spoke with practiced grace, praising Roman valor and urging peace as the nobler form of victory. His words flowed like honey, his gestures calm, his promises generous. Many listened in silence. Some nodded. For a moment, the hall felt suspended between pride and exhaustion. But at the back of the chamber, a rustle broke the quiet. Servants were carrying in a litter draped in white. Upon it lay an old man, blind and frail, his hair the color of ashes. The senators parted as if before an altar. It was Appius Claudius Caecus, the builder of Rome's first great road, the man who had given the Republic its spine of stone. He had not spoken in the Senate for years, but now his voice rose thin and terrible in the silence. Those who could see his face later said it seemed carved from grief. He reminded them of their forefathers who had fought when Rome was little more than a ring of huts. He asked if they would now yield to a foreign king for the sake of comfort. His words stripped away Cineas' diplomacy like leaves before a storm. When he finished, there was no applause, only the murmur of resolve. The Senate refused peace unanimously. Cineas returned to Tarentum bearing no treaty, only a warning. Rome would never negotiate while a foreign army stood on Italian soil. The Republic's answer to victory was endurance. Its reply to persuasion was silence. Pyrrhus read the envoy's report in private. For a long while, he said nothing. Then, turning to his attendants, he ordered the prisoners of Heraclea to be brought before him. Among them stood an austere Roman of middle age, his armor dented, his bearing unbroken. This was Gaius Fabricius, a senator known for integrity so severe it had become legend. Pyrrhus questioned him about the Senate's mood and received answers that were neither flattering nor evasive. The man's honesty intrigued him. Wishing to test the Roman character, the king offered his captive gold an office in exchange for counsel. Fabricius refused without hesitation. Pyrrhus, amused, invited him to dinner, intending to unsettle him with the sight of an elephant, one of the same beasts that had crushed his comrades. When the curtain lifted and the animal trumpeted beside the table, the Roman did not flinch. He simply turned back to his plate and remarked that the beast seemed well fed. Pyrrhus laughed aloud, though the jest left him uneasy. There was something in such calm that no sword could pierce. Days later, one of the king's physicians secretly approached Fabricius, offering to poison his master for a reward. The Roman reported the plot at once. Pyrrhus, astonished, summoned the traitor and had him executed. Then, moved by admiration, he released the senator and his fellow captives without ransom, sending them home as a gesture of goodwill. The gesture failed. Rome thanked him and prepared for the next campaign. New consuls were elected, fresh legions levied. The machine moved forward without hesitation. Where other nations would have bargained, Rome rebuilt. In Tarentum, the Greeks celebrated the return of spring with renewed confidence. But Pyrrhus saw the shadows lengthening. His army was replenished, his elephants rearmed, yet something vital had changed. The first spark of triumph had cooled into calculation. He began to understand that his victories in Italy would resemble those of Heraclea, won by courage, lost by attrition. One evening, as the sun bled over the gulf, he walked the city's outer walls. From that height, the world seemed divided between promise and warning. He thought of Cineas's words before the expedition, urging rest instead of conquest. He remembered the Senate's unwavering silence, the blind elder's voice rising above the assembly, the steady eyes of Fabricius. Each image felt like a stone laid upon his heart. Even so, he could not stop. Ambition had long since hardened into need. To turn back would be to admit that Alexander's dream had ended forever. So he sent orders north. The army would march through Campania, gathering new allies among the Samnites and Lucanians. If Rome would not make peace, then he would bring war to its very gates. That night, the torches in the Epirote camp burned late. Soldiers sharpened pikes and mended armor. The elephants were fed on grain soaked in wine to harden their temper. In the distance, thunder rolled over the mountains, echoing like the march of unseen armies. Pyrrhus stood in his tent, staring at the map spread before him. Each river, each town, each mountain pass was etched into his mind. But the lines no longer looked like roads to glory. They resembled the veins of a living creature, and Rome its beating heart. He realized, with a strange calm, that to pierce it might destroy not only his enemy, but himself. Outside, the rain began to fall, pattering softly on the canvas. The guards watched as their king extinguished the lamp and stepped into the darkness. The war of blades had ended. The war of endurance had begun. Spring broke bright and deceptive across southern Italy. Almond trees flowered white above fields blackened by war, and the rivers ran high from mountain thaw. Beneath that deceptive peace, armies moved, slow, patient, and implacable. From the coast of Tarentum, the Epirot king looked north, where the hills of Lucania faded into haze. There lay the road to Rome, winding through a mosaic of allies and enemies, each watching to see which side would falter first. After Heraclea, Pyrrhus had hoped that diplomacy might tame the Republic. When words failed, he turned again to movement. His banners fluttered in the sea wind as his men broke camp and began the long march inland. The first weeks were a triumph of motion. Veterans of Epirus and Thessaly, their bronze helmets gleaming beneath the sun, marched beside Lucanian and Bruttian contingents who had sworn new allegiance. Samnite envoys rode ahead, promising recruits and supplies. The columns wound through valleys rich with vineyards and olive groves, their spears reflecting the sky like a field of reeds. Children watched from hilltops as the elephants lumbered past, dark silhouettes against the glittering fields. Yet even beauty could not hide fatigue. The campaign stretched over mountains whose slopes tore at hooves and sandals alike. Wagons toppled from narrow passes. Rain turned the roads to rivers of mud. Still the army pressed onward, driven less by command than by the will of its leader. Pyrrhus rode among them constantly. To his men he seemed tireless, but those who followed closest saw the lines deepening around his eyes. Victory had become a habit that failed to satisfy. He needed not applause, but permanence, an empire that would endure beyond his own restless life. Italy offered that vision, a land dense with people and power, where conquest could be civilization. As the army entered the valleys of Campania, the landscape widened into generous plains, dotted with fortified towns. The soil was rich, the harvests abundant, even after years of war. Farmers labored in sight of smoke columns rising from distant battlefields, their stoicism mirroring the nation Pyrrhus meant to defeat. He watched them with reluctant admiration. Rome had taught even its peasants endurance. The first Roman garrisons appeared near the hill town of Beneventum. Their walls bristled with fresh palisades, their fields stripped to deny forage. Skirmishes flared and vanished in dust. The king's cavalry raided the outskirts but met resistance too swift to exploit. At every bridge, every ford, the enemy seemed already waiting. He had expected rebellion among the Italic tribes. Instead, he found caution. The Samnites, broken by earlier wars, offered promises but little substance. Their villages sent small bands of warriors, brave yet weary. The Lucanians hovered between loyalty and fear, while the Bruttians hesitated outright. Each remembered the ruin Rome had visited upon those who defied her, and none wished to be next. Still, Pyrrhus persisted. He moved northward through the fertile fields of Campania, past the smoking ruins of lesser towns, past temples half deserted. In his letters home, he spoke of new allies and vast conquests, but the truth lay heavier. Each mile gained felt borrowed, not claimed. The ground seemed to belong to another will, silent, disciplined, patient. Even the weather seemed to favor his enemy. Torrents swept down from the Apennines, scattering his supply wagons. Fever crept through the camps, thinning ranks before battle could. The Greek soldiers cursed the climate. The Italian allies blamed the gods. Pyrrhus said nothing. At night, he sat before his maps, marking routes that led nowhere. Rumors reached him that Rome was fortifying Capua, the richest city of Campania. If he could seize it, he might fracture the alliance that bound the Latin heartland to its southern dependence. The plan glittered like hope. He marched westward, moving along the old Samnite roads. Villages emptied before his approach. Storehouses burned. The countryside offered silence. By the time he reached the plains before Capua, the gates were shut and the walls newly crowned with watchfires. For 3 days, he watched the city from afar. Its citizens went about their lives as though war were merely a distant rumor. Such confidence enraged him more than resistance. He ordered probing assaults, but each failed under a rain of missiles. The defenders fought with methodical calm, as if they too carried the discipline of the Republic within their blood. Frustration hardened into clarity. The peninsula did not fear him because it no longer thought in fragments. Rome had taught it coherence. Each fortress, each road, each ally was a limb of the same vast body. Strike one, and the others clenched in defense. Against such unity, brilliance felt small. He turned his march eastward, leaving the plains littered with burnt siege equipment. The army crossed into the interior again, moving through Lucanian passes where the forests pressed close. The men were weary now, their songs reduced to murmurs. Even the elephants trudged silently, their shadows long in the late sun. Still, moments of grandeur persisted. At dawn, the columns descended upon valleys veiled in mist, and the sunlight struck the bronze of shields until the hills blazed gold. In those hours, the soldiers believed again that they followed destiny's chosen heir. Pyrrhus himself drew strength from the sight. Each new day, he told himself, could still birth a decisive victory. Yet the countryside told another story. Abandoned farms, scorched orchards, the skeletons of villas rising from charred foundations, signs of a land learning to survive through ruin. The king saw them and felt a pang, not of pity, but recognition. This was what conquest meant when it ceased to be glory and became habit. Near the borders of Apulia, the army halted beside a shallow stream to rest. From a distant ridge came the shimmer of Roman standards. Scouts returned with news. 2 consular armies were moving south to intercept. The campaign through Campania had stirred Rome, but not shaken her. She had called upon every colony, every ally, and the response had been overwhelming. Italy was rising not against her, but for her. That evening, Pyrrhus gathered his officers. They sat beneath an awning of oiled linen, the lamplight reflecting on the maps spread across a wooden table. The king traced the line of rivers and roads with a finger darkened by dust. His voice, when he spoke, was steady but low. They would turn east toward Asculum, where open plains might favor their pikes and elephants. There, perhaps, another Heraclea could be forged. No one contradicted him. Outside, the campfires multiplied, each a small island of light amid the darkness. Soldiers mended sandals or cleaned armor, whispered letters to families far away. The scent of rain mixed with smoke. Thunder murmured beyond the hills. Before sleep, Pyrrhus walked among the tents. The men rose at his passing, but he scarcely saw them. His thoughts drifted back to the speeches of Appius Claudius, to the calm defiance of Fabricius, to the silence of those who had refused to yield. He wondered if he had misunderstood Rome entirely, that her strength was not in armies, but in endurance itself. When dawn came, the army broke camp. The long lines of infantry wound through the narrow valleys, their shields flashing with the first light. Ahead lay Apulia and the plains of Asculum, where another test awaited. Behind them, the fields of Campania smouldered in morning haze, beautiful and desolate at once, a mirror of ambition pressing against the limits of the possible. As the columns disappeared into the mist, only the distant sound of drums remained, fading into the hills. The march had changed nothing, yet altered everything. Pyrrhus still advanced, but his shadow lengthened across the land he sought to master, and Italy itself seemed to watch, patient as stone. The army reached Apulia in the first heat of summer. Plains stretched to the horizon, green with new grain, the rivers glinting like threads of steel beneath the sun. To the west rose the faint outline of the Apennines, and beyond them, though no eye could see it, the long road to Rome. Between the rivers and the low hills stood the city of Asculum, its white walls half hidden by dust. There, Pyrrhus made his camp. His ground favored battle. The open plain was ideal for the phalanx and the elephants that had become his living engines of war. He ordered ditches filled, slopes leveled, and the banks of the Carapel River reinforced with stakes to protect the flanks. When the last tent was pitched, he walked the perimeter, studying the terrain with the eye of a craftsman. This place, he thought, could decide the future of Italy. Across the fields, the Romans were arriving in steady columns. Their camp rose in ordered silence, palisades built with a precision that spoke of long habit. The double consular army, nearly 40,000 legionaries and 5,000 cavalry, was commanded by Publius Decius Mus and Publius Sulpicius Saverio, veterans of the Samnite Wars. They had studied Heraclea well. Their legions now carried heavy javelins, designed to pierce armor and hamstring beasts, and with them came strange wagons, bristling with spikes, hooks, and fire pots, contrivances meant to meet the elephants. For 2 days the armies watched one another across the plain. Patrols skirmished at the fords. The cries of wounded horses drifted through the heat. Then, at dawn, on the 3rd day, horns sounded from both camps, and the valley filled with motion. The first to move were the Romans. Their maniples advanced with shields lifted, the sunlight catching on rows of iron bosses. They crossed the river shouting the name of Decius, the consul whose ancestors had sacrificed themselves in battle for victory. The sound carried across the valley like thunder. Pyrrhus deployed in reply. On the right, he placed the Macedonian phalanx, 20,000 men whose pikes gleamed like reeds under rain. The left he gave to the Samnites and Lucanians, eager to redeem years of defeat. Behind both wings stood the elephants, their howdahs stocked with archers. The center he commanded himself, a small reserve of cavalry and Greek mercenaries, the heart of his army and its will. The clash began in blinding light. The legions struck the phalanx head-on, javelins splintering against shields, swords biting into the forest of pikes. For an hour the battle wavered. Neither formation gave ground. Dust rose so thick that men fought half blind, guided only by the pressure of comrades behind them. On the flanks, the Roman cavalry wheeled again and again, looking for a breach. Then the elephants were brought forward. The beasts moved like mountains in motion, their drivers shouting, their armor shining. The Roman line tightened, shields locking. From behind their ranks rolled the new wagons, grim contraptions fitted with iron prongs and scythes, dragged by oxen and guarded by bowmen. As the elephants charged, the wagons lurched forward to meet them. Flames burst from the pots of pitch, the air filled with the stink of smoke and burning oil. For a moment, the charge faltered. One elephant, struck by a lance through the eye, reared and fell upon its own ranks. Another bolted into the river, scattering men like driftwood. Yet the rest pressed on, trampling the wagons, snapping their axles, crushing oxen and men beneath their weight. The field became a chaos of fire, mud, and screaming beasts. Pyrrhus drove his cavalry into the confusion, rallying his shaken phalanx. The Macedonian pikes lowered again, their rhythm restored. Slowly the Romans began to yield. As evening fell, the two armies drew apart, neither claiming the ground. The plain lay strewn with the wreckage of wagons and bodies that burned where the pitch still smouldered. At dawn, both sides returned to the fight. The second day was fiercer than the first. The Romans had moved to firmer ground, their legions forming a crescent around the riverbank. Pyrrhus countered by shifting his center to the right, forcing them into open terrain. He led the charge himself, the plume of his helmet visible wherever the fighting was thickest. Twice his horse was struck, twice he remounted. Around him the phalanx advanced with the slow inevitability of a tide. The Romans met it with astonishing tenacity. They adapted faster than any foe he had known, breaking formation to exploit the smallest weakness, reforming to resist the next assault. At midday, the battle hung in balance, a grinding contest of endurance. The sun beat down mercilessly. The cries of men and beasts merged into a single vast roar. Late in the afternoon, Pyrrhus committed his last reserve. The elephants advanced again, this time supported by archers and cavalry. The Roman lines bent, then split. Their left wing broke first, collapsing under the weight of the beasts. The right held longer, retreating step by step toward the river until the consul Decius fell, pierced by a pike. The sight unsteadied even his veterans. The legions began to withdraw, not in rout, but in grim order, leaving the field to the Epirote king. When silence returned, it was the silence of exhaustion. The plain of Asculum was a wasteland of corpses, broken spears, and blackened armor. The surviving elephants stood motionless, their hides streaked with blood and ash. Pyrrhus dismounted slowly, the weight of victory pressing heavier than any defeat. Around him lay 6,000 Roman dead, and 3,000 of his own best soldiers beside them. He walked among the bodies as twilight deepened. The smoke of burnt wagons drifted low across the field, mingling with the scent of crushed grass and iron. His officers approached to congratulate him, but he waved them aside. The faces of the fallen blurred together until he could no longer tell friend from foe. The cost was too near. By morning, word spread through the camp. The enemy had retreated north. Asculum was his. The trumpeters sounded, but no one cheered. The men were too weary even to lift their weapons. Pyrrhus sat before his tent, hands clasped on his knees, and stared toward the horizon where the Roman columns were already reforming. He understood now what Rome truly was, an enemy that could not comprehend surrender. The poets of Tarentum would later call Asculum a great triumph. They sang of elephants like thunderclouds and of the king who had mastered them. But those who stood beside him knew better. Victory had begun to taste like ash. In the days that followed, he buried the dead and sent messengers across the sea to Greece and Macedon, calling for reinforcements. He wrote to his wife that the gods had granted him glory but denied him joy. The soldiers rebuilt the camp, repaired shields, and fed the elephants as if preparing for another march. Yet no one spoke of conquest. The war had entered a new age, one of attrition rather than adventure. The legends say that when Pyrrhus reviewed the battlefield one last time, he turned to his generals and murmured that another such success would destroy him. Whether the words were spoken or only imagined, their truth echoed through every camp thereafter. The men who had once followed him for fortune now followed him out of duty, and the fire that had lit the expedition began to dim beneath the weight of its own triumphs. By summer's end, the wounded were healing, the armor mended, and the elephants once again restless for war. The army turned south to rest at Tarentum, leaving behind a plain that smelled of decay and immortality. The Romans were already raising new legions, the Senate unbroken, their resolve renewed. Pyrrhus, gazing west across the dusty horizon, understood that the war he had crossed the sea to win had only truly begun. From the burned fields of Asculum, smoke still wandered through Apulia as the messengers reached their camp. They came by separate roads, one from the north, bearing tidings of Macedon, another from across the sea carrying the desperate seals of Sicily. Both found Pyrrhus at Tarentum, seated in a hall hung with captured standards and the silence of exhaustion. The victory had left him hollow. The songs of the poets meant nothing beside the lists of the dead. Around the harbour, the air smelled of salt, oil, and resentment. The citizens celebrated as if the war were won, but the king knew better. Rome had already levied new legions. Her losses, however vast, had been repaired before his wounded healed. Italy was proving endless. When the Macedonian envoy knelt before him, Pyrrhus scarcely looked up. The news was grave. Ptolemy, the thunderbolt, ruler of Macedon, had fallen in battle against the Gauls. The throne stood vacant, and the army clamored for a proven general to lead them. Macedonia, rich and familiar, beckoned like an old inheritance. For a moment, the thought stirred him. Home reclaimed, Alexander's homeland under his hand. But before the idea could ripen, the second delegation entered, sunburnt men in Greek armor, bearing the smell of the sea. They spoke not of inheritance, but of catastrophe. Across the narrow strait, the Greek cities of Sicily were dying by inches under the siege of Carthage. Syracuse, once mistress of the island, pleaded for rescue. The Carthaginian fleet ruled the western waters. Their garrisons ringed the coast from Lilybaeum to Eryx. If Sicily fell, Greek freedom in the west would vanish. The envoys knelt, holding out olive branches wound with purple thread. Their voices trembled with urgency. They spoke of Pyrrhus as savior, as heir of Alexander, as the one man whose valor could throw back the Phoenician tide. It was flattery, but flattery that fed his soul. That night, he walked alone along the seawall, listening to the hiss of waves against the stones. Behind him lay Italy, proud, divided, ungrateful. Ahead stretched the open water, and beyond it, a new theatre of glory. Sicily glittered in his imagination, a realm of marble ports and fertile plains, an island that could be both fortress and stepping stone. From its harbours he could command the western sea, and perhaps one day strike at Carthage itself. The decision came as dawn reddened the horizon. He would answer Sicily's call. Macedonia could wait. Rome could not be destroyed, but Carthage might be humbled. The thought rekindled the fire that Heraclea and Asculum had dimmed. When he announced his plan to the Tarentine council, the reaction was disbelief. They had invited him as protector, not conqueror, and now he meant to leave them half-defended. The city that had traded liberty for survival faced the prospect of losing both. In the agora, merchants cursed him for abandoning Italy. The Democrats shouted that the gods themselves were deserting their cause. Pyrrhus listened without reply. He had long since learned that gratitude fades faster than victory. Preparations began at once. Shipwrights hauled triremes into dry dock, their hulls resined and reinforced for open sea. Grain stores were emptied into amphorae, weapons loaded by the ton. 8,000 infantry and 2,000 horsemen would accompany him, veterans of Epirus, Thessaly, and Tarentum, the hard core of an army that had seen too much of Italy's dust. The rest would remain behind, under trusted generals to guard the city and hold Rome at bay. From the hills inland came the last of his Italic allies, drawn by rumour and curiosity. The Samnites offered pledges of loyalty. The Lucanians, who had lost more faith than men, bowed stiffly and withdrew. He thanked them all with the courtesy of a ruler who already looked elsewhere. By midsummer, the fleet was ready. The soldiers embarked in silence, their armour gleaming beneath the morning sun. On the quays, the Tarentines gathered to watch. Some wept, others spat curses. Pyrrhus raised his hand in farewell, but not in apology. To him, the departure felt less like retreat than release, the lifting of a burden. The ship slipped out into calm water, their oars flashing like silver fish. Behind them, the harbour gates closed, and the banners of Epirus drooped in the windless air. By evening, the coast had vanished, and the horizon burned with the color of copper. The voyage that followed was perilous. Contrary winds drove the fleet east, and Carthaginian patrols prowled the straits. But fortune, that old seductress, favored him once more. The ships rounded the tip of Sicily unopposed, the peaks of Etna glowing red against the night. They landed first at Tarentum, where a local tyrant opened his gates in reverence. Word of his arrival spread like lightning. Cities long besieged by Carthaginian forces flung open their gates. Mercenary garrisons defected. Greek banners reappeared over the ramparts. In a week, he had gained more by reputation than he had in years of battle. Syracuse, the greatest of them all, sent envoys draped in white to invite him within its walls. The Carthaginian army that had surrounded the city melted away before his advance. When he entered through the sea gate, the crowds hailed him as liberator. Bells rang from the temples, and the streets were carpeted with flowers. It was as though Alexander himself had returned to the west. In that moment, Pyrrhus felt the old intoxication of destiny. The years of hardship on Italian soil receded like a bad dream. Here was the empire he had imagined, an island rich in ships, men, and grain, poised between the worlds of Greece and Africa. He promised to restore order, drive out the Phoenicians, and bring peace to the Hellenes of the sea. The people believed him, and for a time he believed himself. Back in Italy, Tarentum faced the Roman tide alone. Leovinus's successor advanced methodically through Lucania, reclaiming forts one by one. Reports of Roman victories arrived weekly, each more discouraging than the last. The Tarentine council sent frantic letters across the strait, begging Pyrrhus to return. Most went unanswered. His thoughts were fixed on new horizons. In Sicily, he began his campaign in earnest. Syracuse furnished him with a fleet of 140 ships, and reinforcements swelled his ranks. He struck swiftly at Agrigentum, then westward toward the Carthaginian strongholds. One city after another fell, and the island echoed with his name. For a year it seemed that fortune had forgiven him. Beneath the triumph, shadows lengthened. The Sicilians soon discovered that their liberator ruled like a conqueror. His demands for ships and tribute grew heavier. His temper, once fiery, turned imperious. Rumors whispered that he spoke not of freeing the island, but of crossing the sea to seize Carthage itself. The gratitude that had crowned him began to curdle into fear. By the time the olive harvest ripened, embassies from the western cities approached him with hesitation rather than devotion. They pleaded for moderation. He answered with orders. The dream of a united Hellenic West was already fraying. Far to the east, across the waters he had left behind, Rome listened, waited, and rebuilt. Each report of his new victories was studied not with despair, but with patience. The Republic had learned that Pyrrhus' glory consumed itself, city by city, like a fire that spread too fast to last. As autumn descended, he stood upon the ramparts of Syracuse, gazing toward the unseen shores of Africa. The sea shimmered under a fading sun. Behind him lay the towers of a restless island, before him the dark unknown. For a heartbeat he felt as though the whole world balanced upon that horizon. The dream of Alexander reborn and already dying. Sicily received its savior in thunder and flame. The spring of 278 BC found the island trembling beneath two masters. Greek cities desperate for deliverance, and Carthaginian garrisons heavy with gold and fear. Into this conflict came Pyrrhus, born on a tide of expectation greater than any army. From Tarentum he swept south, gathering followers as rivers gather rain. At Campania, the gates opened before him. and the people showered the streets with laurel leaves. He promised them not subjugation, but renewal, the rebirth of a free Hellenic world. When he entered Syracuse, the city that had withstood Carthage for generations, the harbour thundered with acclamation. The tyrant who had ruled it fled without a fight. Ships fired their salute. Temples blazed with torches. It was as if Alexander's shade had crossed the sea to dwell among them. For a time, fortune obeyed his hand. The Carthaginian armies, unprepared for such speed, abandoned their sieges and fell back to the western fortresses. Agrigentum surrendered after brief resistance, its walls lined with citizens weeping in relief. Messina pledged allegiance. Across the island, Greek banners rose again, above towers blackened by years of war. Wherever he marched, the people greeted him as deliverer, and his soldiers began to believe they had been chosen for a divine mission. Yet victory's music soon deepened into dissonance. The more cities he liberated, the more power he claimed for himself. Syracuse, once a republic of proud merchants and scholars, awoke to find garrisons quartered in its squares and decrees signed not by magistrates but by a king's own hand. The fleets of allied cities were merged into a single armada under his seal. When his advisors protested that Sicilian pride might not endure such command, he replied only that unity demanded obedience. He saw what others could not or would not. The island's strength was its position, a gate between seas, a jewel between continents. In his mind's eye, Pyrrhus already saw a greater empire stretching from the Ionian coast to Africa's sands. He spoke of crossing the sea, of burning Carthage to its foundations, of returning east crowned by conquest. But the Sicilians, weary of tyrants and wars, longed not for new horizons, but for peace. Still, they followed, while victory endured. His first campaign carried him along the southern coast, where city after city fell in quick succession. At Heraclea Minoa, his engines of siege hurled stones heavier than men. The defenders fled before his machines, as if the gods themselves had come. From there, he advanced towards Selinus and Segesta, where even the Carthaginian garrisons surrendered without resistance. By winter, only one fortress remained unbroken, Lilybaeum, the Carthaginian citadel at the island's western tip. Its harbour opened toward Africa. Its walls were as thick as the hull of a trireme. To hold Lilybaeum was to hold the sea. Pyrrhus gathered his full might before it. 30,000 infantry, 3,000 horse, and the remnants of his elephants, now scarred from their Italian wars. The siege began under a sky of unbroken blue. Catapults thundered day and night. Towers rolled forward on creaking wheels. Miners burrowed beneath the walls. Yet the defenders fought with a ferocity that matched his own. Carthaginian engineers doused the siege works with fire, their countermines erupting beneath his feet. When the battering rams broke through an outer gate, they found another wall behind it, higher than the first. The smoke of the burning machines drifted out to sea, where Carthage's fleet glittered in the distance, untouchable. Month followed month. The spring crops withered under trampling feet. Disease crept through the camps. Supplies dwindled. The Greek cities that had welcomed him now hesitated to send grain or silver. Even Syracuse, once jubilant, grew quiet. The people whispered that the liberator had brought the island not freedom, but famine. Among Pyrrhus' officers was Thoenon, the Syracusan, who had first opened the city gates to him. Loyal, proud, and blunt in counsel, he urged the king to abandon the siege before the army starved. Pyrrhus heard the advice and dismissed it. Each failure, he believed, could still be undone by will. Yet as weeks passed, suspicion began to corrode reason. The supply convoys had grown irregular. Ships vanished between ports. Some said Carthaginian gold had found its way into friendly hands. When the walls of Lilybaeum held firm, despite every assault, his anger turned inward, then outward. He accused Thuanon of treachery, claiming the Syracusan had sold secrets to the enemy. No trial followed. One morning, the general's body hung from the ramparts of the camp, his face covered with a linen shroud. The soldiers who passed beneath it whispered but did not speak aloud. In that moment, Sicily's faith in its champion began to die. The Carthaginians, watching from their towers, sent envoys under flags of truce to offer peace. They promised recognition of his rule over the eastern cities if he would abandon the west. Pyrrhus refused, declaring that compromise was defeat. Yet when another assault ended in ruin, even he could no longer ignore reality. The sea beyond the fortress was dark with enemy sails, their lines unbroken. He could not storm the harbour. He could not outlast the blockade. The vision of conquest dissolved into smoke. By late summer, he ordered the siege lifted. His army, once jubilant, marched eastward in sullen silence. The people of the towns he had liberated no longer lined the roads with flowers. Doors stayed shut as the columns passed. They had seen too many victors to believe in another. In Syracuse, the mood had turned. The markets were empty, the granaries near bare. The council met in secret to discuss sending envoys to Carthage. When Pyrrhus returned, they greeted him with ceremony, but no joy. He sensed the change instantly. In their eyes he saw not admiration, but fear. For several days he remained within the citadel, issuing no proclamations. Then, at dawn, he summoned his officers. The campaign in Sicily was over. He would return to Italy, where Rome was again on the march, and Tarentum was calling for aid. The soldiers greeted the decision with weary relief. The island that had promised empire had given them only hunger and ghosts. Before his departure, Pyrrhus walked alone along the walls above the great harbour. Below him, the ships lay ready, sails furled, masts dark against the pale sea. From the west came the faint echo of drums from Carthaginian garrisons. Victory in slow, patient rhythm. He watched the sunlight flash upon the water and thought of all he had gained and squandered. A few attendants lingered behind him as he turned away. They said later that he paused once, looking back toward the island that had betrayed him, or that he had betrayed. His voice, when he spoke, was barely a murmur, more to himself than to them. The words were bitter with truth. Sicily would remain a prize for others to fight over. He left it to them. The fleet sailed with the next favourable wind. As the last of the coastline sank beneath the horizon, Pyrrhus felt the old weariness settle upon him again. Behind lay the dream of empire. Ahead waited the hard soil of Italy and the iron persistence of Rome. The gods of fortune had granted him every victory except the one that mattered. The ability to rest. The sea that had carried Pyrrhus to Sicily now bore him back in silence. The winds were cold and uncertain, and the ships moved sluggishly, their sails heavy with damp. Behind them the island receded into haze, a gleam of land fading beneath a grey sky. He stood upon the prow of his flagship and did not look back. The Western dream had collapsed into exhaustion. When the fleet reached Tarentum, the harbour lay half empty, its once crowded quays eroded by neglect. The people came out to greet him, but their cheers were hollow. Years of war had drained the city's spirit. Fields lay unploughed, ships unmanned, treasuries hollowed by tribute and fear. Rome's banners were already visible in the northern hills. The king's return brought both relief and apprehension. He came not as a saviour triumphant, but as a commander who had learned the limits of fortune. The veterans who disembarked with him were fewer than when they had sailed away. 8,000 infantry, 500 cavalry, the remnants of an army once famed across the world. They carried with them scars, hunger, and the silence of men who had seen victory sour. Tarentum's council begged for protection. Pyrrhus answered with weary resolve. He would fight once more, though his heart no longer trusted destiny. Messengers rode through Lucania and Samnium calling for allies, but few answered. The old tribes had lost too many sons to follow the Epirote eagle again. Some sent token contingents, others sent apologies. The Romans had learned to make loyalty safer than rebellion. Even so, he began his march north in the spring of 275 BC. The land he had crossed as conqueror now seemed colder, heavier. Villages that once offered tribute now shut their gates. In Lucania, he found the roads patrolled by Roman scouts, the valleys stripped of grain. He pushed onward through rain and fog, driving his men harder than prudence allowed. The elephants, few and weakened, struggled through the mud. At Beneventum, an old Samnite stronghold newly fortified under Roman control, he found the legions waiting. The consul, Manius Curius Dentatus, had chosen his ground well, a broad plateau overlooking the valleys, protected by steep slopes and wooded hills. To reach him, Pyrrhus would have to fight uphill, the phalanx constricted by terrain that denied its strength. The king studied the sight in brooding silence and resolved upon audacity. At dusk, he ordered a detachment, his finest troops and the remaining elephants, to make a night march through the forest and fall upon the Roman camp from the rear at dawn. The main force would attack from the front once the horns of the ambush sounded. If the maneuver succeeded, the battle would end before it began. The night was moonless and treacherous. The path twisted through dense thickets where even the elephants hesitated. The Samnite guides muttered among themselves, unsure of the turns. Hours passed, torches guttered and died. Somewhere in the dark, the line splintered. Companies drifted off course, calling to one another in low voices that drew echoes from the trees. When the first light crept over the hills, the forest still held them captive. Down on the plain, the main army waited for a signal that never came. Pyrrhus watched the eastern sky brighten with unease, hardening into anger. He could hear the distant rumble of Roman drums, but no answering horns from the ambush. At last, he gave the order to advance. The phalanx moved uphill, its rhythm broken by rocks and roots. Javelins rained down from above, striking shields and helmets. The legions held their ground at the ridge, their ranks deep and patient. Each time the Epirot spears surged forward, they met the counterweight of Roman discipline. The slope turned into a theatre of exhaustion, men slipping, reforming, dying where they fell. From the woods behind the Roman camp came a sudden clamour, his lost detachment emerging too late, disordered and exposed. The consul saw his chance. He wheeled his reserves to meet them, the hillside flashing with the reflection of steel. The elephants, frightened by the trumpet calls and the narrow ground, broke formation and bolted downhill through their own ranks. Some crashed into the phalanx. Others charged wildly toward the enemy lines, crushing friend and foe alike. The Roman skirmishers seized the moment. Swarming forward, they hurled volleys of pila at the maddened beasts. Blades and firepots struck their hides, driving them back upon the Epirote infantry. Confusion spread like wildfire. Pyrrhus galloped to stem the collapse, his horse foaming, his voice hoarse with command. He rallied a knot of guards and hurled them into the fray, but order would not return. From the heights, the legions descended with the force of an avalanche. Shields locked, They pressed forward in silent determination. The Epirot lines bent, then fractured. Men dropped their pikes and fled toward the low ground, pursued by the rhythm of advancing shields. Pyrrhus fought until his sword broke in his hand. Only when the remnants of his guard pulled him back did he allow retreat. By midday, the battle was lost. Smoke hung over the hills, and the cries of the wounded echoed through the trees. The Romans held the field. Manius Curius Dentatus, calm amid victory, ordered the surviving elephants captured rather than slain. When they were driven into the Roman camp, the beasts turned their fury on their former masters, scattering what remained of Pyrrhus' pursuit. It was a fitting end to the day, the instruments of his triumphs, now symbols of defeat. He gathered his shattered army a few miles south of the battlefield. The soldiers stood in silence as he passed, mud and blood streaking their armor. No speeches were made. The king's face revealed nothing, but those who looked closely saw the flicker of something colder than rage: acceptance. The invincible commander of Heraclea and Asculum had met his limit. That night, rain swept across the camp, hissing on the dying fires. Pyrrhus sat alone beneath a canopy, the sound of thunder mingling with the groans of the wounded. On the table before him lay the broken hilt of his sword. He turned it in his hand as if it were a relic of another life. At dawn, he ordered withdrawal toward Tarentum. The retreat was orderly, almost ceremonial, as though pride demanded dignity where victory had failed. Behind them, the Romans did not pursue. They had no need. The battle had already written the outcome of the war. In the following days, news spread across the peninsula. Pyrrhus defeated, his elephants taken, his aura of destiny shattered. The cities that had wavered between Rome and rebellion now chose the safer master. Samnite and Lucanian envoys vanished. Greek towns reopened negotiations with the Senate. The tide had turned, and the man who once seemed to command fortune now followed its ebb. As his army limped south through the ravaged countryside, Pyrrhus felt the old fire flicker and fade. Each mile seemed to draw him farther, not only from Rome, but from the dream that had carried him across the sea. His victories had been brilliant, his defeats instructive, yet neither had brought him what he sought: permanence. When the hills of Tarentum finally came into view, he paused to watch the light fall upon the gulf. The sea lay calm, indifferent, as if mocking both triumph and ruin. He thought of the endless march, the battles won and lost, the cities liberated and subdued, the shifting loyalties of men. It seemed now that war itself had been his only true homeland. Behind him, the soldiers tramped onward, their armor dulled by dust. Before him, the city waited with gates half open, uncertain whether to welcome or fear him. Above all hung the quiet knowledge that the great experiment was ending. The age of Hellenic kingship in the west had burned bright and brief, and its last flame was guttering out beneath the Italian sun. Each mile south from Beneventum passed in silence, the air thick with dust and fatigue. The soldiers who had once followed their king with songs now walked with heads bowed, their footsteps muffled in the clay roads of Campania. The elephants that survived stumbled along behind, scarred and broken, their handlers leading them like penitent giants. No trumpets sounded, no standards glittered. The war that had begun in triumph was dissolving into endurance. Pyrrhus rode at the center of the column, his cloak drawn close against the drizzle. The veterans called him the Eagle, but his wings were tired. He had gambled everything on the promise of Italy and found himself richer in experience, poorer in everything else. The hills through which they passed were familiar, fields once friendly, now stripped bare, Villages closed their gates, unwilling to be seen, aiding a fading cause. Even the peasants who had once brought food to the campfires turned away. At night, the soldiers camped in silence. Fires burned low, and conversation dwindled to murmurs. The talk was not of Rome, but of home. Wives, sons, the smell of olive groves after rain. Pyrrhus listened without rebuke. He understood now that exhaustion was stronger than loyalty. Rumors spread like smoke. Samnite chiefs had made peace. Lucanian tribes had surrendered. Brudians were suing for clemency. Allies became subjects overnight. Only Tarentum still clung to the memory of resistance, and even there, the spirit was faltering. The Romans had advanced methodically through Apulia and Lucania, reclaiming each fortress the king had taken. Their legions moved with the patience of time itself, undoing his conquests one by one. When Pyrrhus reached the outskirts of Tarentum, the city gates opened to admit him in uneasy ceremony. The streets were empty. The marble facades that had once reflected torchlight and music now stood grey and weathered. The people gathered in the agora, but did not cheer. They had learned that each of his victories was followed by a greater peril. He dismounted at the foot of the council hall and entered alone. The archons rose stiffly from their benches. They had aged since he last saw them, as if years of anxiety had been compressed into months. The oldest of them spoke first, his voice dry as parchment. The city had no strength left, he said. The treasury was empty, the fields untended, the young men gone to war. Rome was offering terms, harsh but survivable. Pyrrhus listened, his face expressionless. When the old man finished, he said only that he would not forbid their peace, but he would not sign it. He had come to fight for their freedom, not to bargain for his own defeat. The council bowed, partly in respect, partly in relief. For several days he lingered in the harbour, reorganizing what remained of his forces. The wounded were left behind with local healers. The ships were refitted for the voyage home. His officers begged him to stay, to rebuild, to strike again next season. He shook his head. "The season of miracles is over," he said once to his aide, though only the aide heard it. When the fleet finally assembled, the sea lay calm and bright as if mocking their weariness. The soldiers embarked with mechanical obedience, each man clutching his kit as though afraid to wake from a long dream. Tarentum's citizens stood along the quays in silence. Some crossed themselves in the Greek fashion, others turned away. None shouted farewell. Before boarding, Pyrrhus climbed the steps of the harbour wall and looked once more upon the city he had failed to save. The sun was setting over the gulf, turning the waters red and gold. The towers of Tarentum glowed as if gilded by firelight, beautiful and fragile. He felt no anger, only the faint ache of inevitability. Rome's order would come as surely as the tide. He gave a single command to his admiral, and the ships cast off. The oars dipped in unison, breaking the surface like the strokes of a slow heartbeat. The fleet moved eastward, the wake widening behind until the coastline blurred into distance. Tarentum dwindled to a line of pale stone, then to nothing at all. For the first time in years, the king allowed himself to rest. He sat on the deck beneath a worn canopy, listening to the rhythm of the waves. Around him, the officers whispered of home, of Ambratia's hills, of the clear rivers of Epirus. But his thoughts drifted elsewhere. He had crossed half the world in search of purpose and found only the measure of endurance. Victory had shown him the cost of ambition. Defeat had shown him its futility. When the fleet reached Corcyra, a storm scattered the ships. Some were driven against the rocks. Others limped into the Epirote ports days later. Pyrrhus' own vessel survived, though the mast cracked under the wind. The sailors said the gods were not finished with him yet. In Ambracia, the capital he had left years before in glory, the people came out to greet him with garlands and cheers. They had heard of Heraclea and Asculum, but not of Beneventum. To them, he was still the king who had matched Rome in battle. He smiled and accepted their praise, though it felt like flattery spoken to a statue. In private, he took account of what remained. His treasury was nearly empty. His veterans, though loyal, were too few to rebuild the dream of empire. Yet he was alive, and as long as he drew breath, ambition could stir again. Already letters were arriving from Greece, letters of intrigue, of opportunity, of war. The world, it seemed, still had use for restless men. But that would come later. For now, he walked the terraces of his palace overlooking the Araxes River. Below, the city thrived in small domestic rhythms. The ring of hammers, the laughter of children, the scent of olive fires at dusk. The simplicity unsettled him. He had spent too long in the company of armies to find comfort in peace. He thought often of Italy, of its hills and rivers, its stubborn defenders. He remembered Fabricius and Appius Claudius, men of iron who could not be bought or broken. He recalled the steady advance of Roman cohorts, the sound of their horns echoing through valleys that had once been Greek. For the first time, he wondered if their endurance, not his brilliance, had truly marked the age. When night fell, he stood by the window and watched the river glitter under the moon. Somewhere across the sea, Rome was tightening her grasp over Tarentum, over Lucania, over every fragment of the world he had tried to save. The Greek colonies would fade into memory, their freedom reduced to lines in a scholar's chronicle. Yet he felt no hatred. The Republic had earned what it claimed, not by fortune, but by will. As the wind stirred the curtains, he turned away from the view. His campaigns in Italy had ended, but their echo would endure longer than his life. He had shown the world that Rome could bleed, and Rome had shown him that endurance could outlast genius. Between them, the age of kings and the age of republics had touched and recoiled, never to meet again. Eastward, across the sea, Pyrrhus carried away the last hope of Tarentum. When the fleet vanished beyond the horizon, the city stood alone between sea and enemy. Its marble towers gleamed in the sunlight, but within its walls there was little left of splendor, only hunger, fear, and the echo of promises unkept. The soldiers who remained, veterans of the Epirot king, watched the northern hills for dust clouds that never came. Rome was coming, not as a storm, but as a tide. The Senate had learned caution from years of fighting a genius. Its legions advanced methodically, fortifying every pass and cutting every road. The war was no longer against Pyrrhus. It was against the memory of him. In the year 272 BC, 2 consuls led a combined army into Apulia, and the siege of Tarentum began. From the sea, Roman ships closed the harbour mouth, their sails black against the pale water. It was said that among them sailed allies from Carthage, whose admirals had once warred against the Greeks of Sicily. The alliance was born of calculation rather than friendship. Both powers wished to deny Pyrrhus a foothold, and both understood that domination required cooperation, if only for a moment. Carthaginian triremes patrolled the outer gulf, while Roman galleys ringed the shore. Between them, the city's lifeline was severed. Within the walls, famine grew as steadily as the blockade. The granaries were near empty, and the price of bread rose like smoke. Citizens gathered in the agora to petition the council, but no grain caravans came, no sails appeared on the horizon. The old men who had once debated philosophy now argued over rations. The theatres stood abandoned. The gymnasia was silent except for the coughs of the hungry. Command of the garrison had been left to Milo, one of Pyrrhus' officers, a soldier of discipline but not imagination. He ruled with severity, suspecting treachery in every corner. His loyalty to the absent king was beyond question. His patience with civilians was not. When the city's leaders urged negotiation, he dismissed them. They would fight to the last, he declared, as though honor could feed a starving population. Outside the walls, the Romans waited. They built siege lines of timber and earth, encircling the city like a tightening noose. Every few days, heralds approached the gates offering leniency in exchange for surrender. Milo answered with arrows, yet the attackers showed no haste. They knew time would do their work for them. Each week, their blockade drew tighter. Each month, the city's fires burned lower. By mid-year, the harbour stank of decay. Dead fish floated between the quays, trapped by the Roman chains across the entrance. The once glittering waters of the Gulf were streaked with oil and ash. Tarentum's proud fleet, beached and broken, lay rotting on the sand. Even the sea seemed to have turned its back. Inside the city, desperation bred division. The aristocrats argued for negotiation, fearing total ruin. The Democrats demanded resistance, clinging to the illusion that Pyrrhus would return. Word spread that Carthaginian ships had been seen in the Gulf, not as rescuers, but as Rome's partners. The revelation crushed the last illusion of Greek unity. Across the agora, statues of past heroes looked down on an exhausted people who no longer believed in salvation. Milo held the citadel with a shrinking garrison. His men were paid in promises. Their armor rusted for lack of oil. At night, he walked the battlements, staring toward the sea, perhaps hoping to glimpse the sails of a king who would never come. What thoughts moved behind his rigid expression, no one could tell. But as the siege dragged on, his discipline began to waver. Letters intercepted by Roman scouts spoke of secret meetings, of negotiations begun in darkness. In early autumn, the end came quietly. A Roman envoy was admitted to the citadel under truce. What was said within its walls was never recorded. 2 nights later, while the citizens slept, the outer gates opened to the besieging army. At dawn, Roman cohorts marched through the streets without resistance. There was no battle cry, no massacre, only the measured tramp of soldiers filling the avenues once alive with Greek laughter. When the citizens awoke, the standard of the Republic hung over the Acropolis. Milo's men had melted away, and their commander had vanished. Some said he escaped with Roman protection, others that he was slain in secret by his own guards. Whatever his fate, his betrayal spared the city destruction. Rome entered Tarentum not as conqueror drunk on victory, but as administrator claiming inheritance. The consuls imposed order with efficiency that felt like fate. The temples were sealed, the council dissolved, the city's walls dismantled stone by stone. A garrison occupied the citadel. The harbour was reopened under Roman law. Slaves swept the bloodless streets. For the first time in centuries, the agora heard Latin voices conducting business in the language of authority. Carthaginian ships anchored in the outer Gulf as if to observe the ceremony. Their commanders were honoured guests, witnesses to the passing of an age. 2 powers, Rome on land, Carthage at sea, acknowledged one another in wary respect, dividing the Western world between them without a treaty. For a brief moment, the horizon seemed balanced between them, the world holding its breath before the wars yet to come. Among the citizens, resignation replaced despair. Some were deported to distant colonies. others reduced to serfdom on their own estates. The philosophers and teachers who had once filled the porticos packed their scrolls and fled to Greece. Those who remained grew silent, their pride buried beneath the weight of new laws. Greek Tarentum had become Roman Tarentum, and with it the last light of Magna Graecia dim. As soon as the dispatch reached the Senate, a herald proclaimed its contents to the assembled forum. The crowd listened in silence. There was no triumphal parade, no festival of conquest. The Republic celebrated by returning to its work. A marble tablet was inscribed: Tarentum subdued, Italy secured. The message was simple, final, and true. Far across the sea, in the palace of Ambracia, Pyrrhus received the news without surprise. The letter lay unopened for a day upon his table before he broke the seal. The words inside were brief, formal, and absolute. Tarentum had surrendered. The campaign was over. He read it once, then burned it over a lamp flame. The ashes curled and drifted upward, scattering like the remnants of a dream too long pursued. That night, he walked the terraces overlooking the river. The water flowed calmly, reflecting the stars that seemed older than empires. He thought of the streets of Tarentum, the marble columns now shadowed by foreign banners, the harbour where he had once watched his fleet depart for Sicily. He had given the city every virtue that ambition could command: courage, brilliance, endurance. And in return, it had offered him the lesson he had refused to learn: that glory is a debt the world collects in silence. Back in Italy, the Romans built roads southward, binding the new territories with stone. The conquered towns became allies, then citizens. Greek art and thought would live on, but only as adornment to the power that had defeated them. The republic that began as a city on the Tiber had become a continent in waiting. And so, the torch passed. The Greeks had taught the world how to think. Rome would teach it how to rule. On the Gulf, where once rang the hymns of Apollo, Latin voices now recited laws. The sea was the same, the hills unchanged, but the age had turned. The dream of Magna Graecia was over. Sometimes, in the stillness before battle, Pyrrhus remembered how it had begun. A boy carried from his burning homeland into exile, a youth fighting beside Demetrius on the plains of Ipsus, where the heirs of Alexander tore their master's dream to pieces. The thunder of that battle, elephants screaming, phalanxes splintering under the weight of their own glory, had never left him. He had spent his life chasing that sound across continents, believing that somewhere within its echo he might find meaning. But age had turned that memory into a warning. Every empire begins as vision and ends as ruin. Now, in the winter of 274 BC, the restlessness that had driven him all his life returned. The palace at Ambracia was quiet, its halls hung with trophies of lost victories. Macedonia, scarred by Gallic raids, called for a strong hand. Pyrrhus heard the summons and answered as he always had, not from need, but from habit. He gathered his veterans, crossed the mountains, and once more became the storm that others tried to withstand. The campaign through the Aous Valley was swift and brutal. Macedonian cities surrendered without resistance, their garrisons joining his ranks. When Antigonus Gonatas marched to oppose him, the old rivals met on a narrow plain hemmed by cliffs. The Epirote phalanx advanced with mechanical precision. The elephants, relics of vanished glory, crushed the Macedonian cavalry. Antigonus fled toward Thessalonica, leaving the crown behind. For a brief moment, Pyrrhus sat upon the throne of Alexander's homeland and found it weightless. The fire that had once promised transcendence now flickered like a spent lamp. He might have stayed to rule, but peace was poison to him. South of the Isthmus, a Spartan exile named Cleonymus begged his aid in reclaiming a stolen throne. Pyrrhus saw in the plea an excuse for movement. The Peloponnese, land of heroes and ancient pride, beckoned. He crossed by sea with 25,000 men, chasing one more mirage of conquest. The invasion of Laconia was swift, its failure swifter. Sparta's walls were held not by kings, but by women and elders, who dug trenches and bore arms with quiet ferocity. For 3 days his assaults broke upon their defences. When reinforcements returned from Crete under King Pyrrhus, the Epirote lines collapsed. He withdrew, cursing the gods who had turned courage into futility. As the army retreated north, disaster struck. His son Ptolemy, leading the rear, was ambushed and slain. Pyrrhus heard the news on the march and did not speak. Those near him saw only the hardening of his face, grief sublimated into rage. The road ahead led to Argos, where 2 factions feuded for control, each summoning a different king. He marched there like a man walking toward fate. Night cloaked the city when he arrived. Argive sympathizers opened a gate, and his Gauls and elephants poured into the streets. The darkness betrayed them. Alleyways twisted, signals were lost. Antigonus's reinforcements entered from the opposite side. The city became a labyrinth of confusion and flame. An elephant jammed itself in a narrow gate, trapping hundreds within. By dawn, the streets ran with blood. Amid the chaos, Pyrrhus fought like a man possessed, his armor dented, his sword slick. Near the theatre, a youth lunged and pierced his breastplate. The king struck him down, and above them, a mother, watching from a rooftop, hurled a roof tile in desperate fury. It struck Pyrrhus on the head, and he fell to one knee, the world darkening around him. In that final heartbeat, he saw again the sunlit plain of Ipsus, the elephants, the dust, the impossible brightness of beginnings, and understood that he had been chasing that first light all his life. The rest was silence. When Antigonus entered the city, he found the body in the marketplace, covered it with his cloak, and wept. The corpse was returned to Epirus in a bronze coffin, where his people buried him beside the river that had once mirrored his armies on the march. With Pyrrhus' death, the lineage of Alexander's dream ended. The kings who followed would fight not for empire, but for survival. The last adventurer of the Hellenistic age had fallen, a man who mistook movement for destiny, whose brilliance could win every battle except the one against time. When the news of Pyrrhus' death reached Tarentum, the city did not weep. It was already Roman, its harbour patrolled by galleys bearing the wolf of the Republic. The citizens bowed their heads, more from exhaustion than mourning, and went back to their work. The name that had once filled Italy with dread was now only an echo. Across the peninsula, the age of Hellenic kings and mercenary alliances was finished. Rome ruled, and ruled without splendor. Her generals carried no gold-threaded banners, her legions marched without music, but wherever they went, roads and laws followed. The patchwork of tribes and colonies that had once divided Italy had been welded together in the fire of necessity. From the snows of the Apennines to the warm shores of Calabria, one discipline bound them all: the Roman idea of permanence. The Senate celebrated no triumph for Tarentum, no festival for Pyrrhus' fall. The conquest was absorbed into administration, the victory into duty. The Republic's strength lay not in ecstasy, but in continuity. While kings spent themselves chasing glory, Rome built walls, aqueducts, and alliances. Her wars were not acts of ambition, but of inevitability. Each step she took was made to last. South of the new Roman frontier, the survivors of Magna Graecia faded into quiet provincial life. Croton, Heraclea, and Metapontum still stood, their temples cracked but upright. Greek words were still spoken in the markets, but the inscriptions beneath their statues now appeared in Latin. In the porticos, the philosophers who had once lectured on freedom debated instead the nature of order. The young men of the colonies no longer looked east across the sea toward Athens and Corinth. They looked north toward Rome, where decisions were made. From these conquered coasts, the Republic drew more than tribute. It absorbed the very culture it had subdued. Greek tutors taught the children of senators. Greek sculptors carved the gods of the capital. Greek physicians tended Roman wounds. Even Pyrrhus, who had come as destroyer, became a lesson. His name passed into language, not as conqueror, but as warning. A Pyrrhic victory came to mean the triumph that costs too much, the glory that devours itself. In Epirus, his tomb overlooked the river that glittered like a shard of mirror beneath the mountains. Travelers stopped there on their way to Delphi and spoke of him with reverence or pity. They said he had been the last of the heroes, the last to believe that courage alone could command destiny. His wars had spanned 3 lands and 2 worlds, yet he had left behind only stories and the whisper of elephants vanishing into legend. Beyond those mountains, Greece itself was unraveling. The heirs of Alexander were kings in name only, guarding their fragile territories against one another. The great libraries of the East copied scrolls of history faster than new victories could be written. The memory of empire persisted, but its pulse was faint. The age of men who sought to equal the gods was ending, replaced by an age of men who preferred to govern the earth. Rome watched all of this from across the Adriatic. The Senate saw opportunity in decline. The roads built to reach Tarentum would one day extend to Corinth. The legions that had learned to fight Greek phalanxes would soon learn to conquer them. The Republic's generals spoke not of philosophy, but of logistics, not of destiny, but of duty. In that pragmatism lay the secret of empire. The gods, it seemed, had shifted their favor. The fire that had once burned in the Greek heart, the restless brilliance of inquiry and daring, now kindled in Roman form. Austere, methodical, enduring. The marble age gave way to one of iron and stone. And yet the legacy of Pyrrhus lingered. He had been the mirror in which Rome saw its own reflection, the warning of what it might become if courage outran wisdom. His wars had taught her endurance, discipline, and restraint. Even as his ambitions perished, his example refined the enemy that survived him. When centuries later Roman armies crossed to Greece, their generals would pause before his statue at Delphi, studying the face that had once defied their ancestors. Some claimed the bronze eyes seemed almost alive, as if watching the torch he had dropped being carried onward. In this way, his story did not end with his death. It became part of the foundation of the world that followed. The Greeks had imagined greatness as brilliance that flares and fades. The Romans would imagine it as fire that never dies. Between those visions lay the turning of an age. On the shores of Tarentum, the sea still glittered, unchanged. Fishermen cast their nets where once triremes had gathered. Children played among the stones of fallen temples. The winds that once filled the sails of Pyrrhus now carried the Roman fleets westward, toward Sardinia, Spain, and the wider Mediterranean, toward history itself. The dream of Hellenic freedom had ended, but not its spirit. It lived on in the laws Rome would write, in the sculptures she would raise, in the words that would name her empire. Pyrrhus had lost everything he sought, yet in losing, he became the bridge between worlds, the last echo of Alexander and the first shadow of Caesar. And so, in the long twilight of the ancient world, the torch passed west. The age of kings was over. the age of Rome had begun.